It was 3:17 a.m., on a Tuesday that smelled of iodine, floor wax, and the metallic tang of old blood. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's emergency ward hummed with a headache-inducing flicker, casting long, sickly shadows across the linoleum. Nia stood over the sink in the scrub room, the cold water turning pink as it swirled down the drain. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash that always followed a resuscitation. She was 26 years old, with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 witnessed tragedies, yet in this moment, she looked small against the sterile, white tiles. She adjusted her blue surgical scrubs, the fabric stiff with dried sweat, and took a deep breath. She had saved him. The John Doe in Trauma Bay had come in with a severed femoral artery and no insurance, a ghost to the system. The protocol demanded she stabilize and transfer to a county facility. The protocol demanded she save the expensive coagulants for viable patients. Nia had ignored the protocol. She had used the expensive clotting agent. She had stitched him up with the precision of a seamstress mending fine silk. He was breathing. That was all that mattered. But the silence of the scrub room was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clacking of Italian leather shoes on the hard floor. Click, click, click. The sound was predatory. Nia didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Director Holloway. He was young for an administrator, barely 30, with a jawline he thought made him look authoritative, but only made him look petulant. He wore suits that cost more than Nia's annual salary, and he viewed the hospital not as a sanctuary of healing, but as a ledger of profit and loss. He stopped in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a casual arrogance that made Nia's stomach turn. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the inventory checklist on his tablet. The thrombolytic agent, Holloway said, his voice smooth and devoid of humanity. Batch 44X. $5,000 a dose. You administered it to a vagrant, Nia. He finally looked up, his pale blue eyes cold and accusing. A vagrant who will likely overdose within the week if he survives the night. You stole from this hospital. Nia turned off the tap. She dried her hands with a rough paper towel, her movements slow and deliberate. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. I saved a life, Director. His vitals were crashing. By the time the transfer paperwork cleared, he would have bled out on the gurney. I took an oath, Holloway laughed, a dry, barking sound that echoed in the small room. Oaths don't pay for MRIs, nurse. Oaths don't keep the lights on. You have a habit of confusing this emergency room with a charity ward. We've discussed this. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, smelling of expensive cologne and stale coffee. This was your final warning. You're a liability. Emotional. Reckless. You don't have the stomach for the business of medicine. He held out his hand, palm up. Your badge. Now. You're done. The words hung in the air like smoke. Fired. For saving a life. Nia stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of stone. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. That was what Holloway wanted. He fed on the desperation of the staff, on the power trip of holding their livelihoods in his manicured hands. Instead, Nia reached her collar and unclipped the plastic ID card that identified her as a senior trauma nurse. It felt heavy in her hand, a symbol of 4 years of sleepless nights, missed holidays, and the blood she had scrubbed from under her fingernails. She dropped it into Holloway's palm. It made a hollow plastic clatter. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice quiet but possessing a strange, resonant gravity. Not because I need this job, but because you have forgotten what this building is for, Holloway smirked, pocketing the badge as if it were a trophy. I think I'll manage without your morality lectures. Security will escort you out. Don't linger. He turned on his heel and walked away, already typing on his tablet, dismissing her existence before he had even left the room. Nia was left alone with the humming lights and the smell of bleach, the silence pressing in on her like a physical weight. She was stripped of her title, but strangely, she felt lighter. The chains of a broken system had just been cut. The walk to the locker room felt like a funeral procession of one. The hospital corridors were dim at this hour, populated only by the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and the soft squeak of rubber soles. Nia kept her head high, though inside, a storm was brewing. Panic was starting to claw at the edges of her composure. Rent was due in 3 days. Her student loans were a crushing mountain that never seemed to shrink. She had no family here, no safety net. She was a brilliant nurse, yes, but in a city that ran on connections and nepotism, a firing for misconduct would blacklist her. She opened her locker, number 104, and began to pack. A stethoscope, a spare pair of comfortable shoes, a framed photo of her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to send her to nursing school. She placed them into a worn canvas tote bag. Every object was a memory, and packing them away felt like amputating a limb. She changed out of her scrubs into civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple gray sweater, but kept the blue scrub top on underneath, a layer of armor she wasn't ready to shed. As she closed the locker door, the metal clanged with a finality that made her flinch. Holloway was waiting by the nurse's station, watching her with a smug expression, ensuring she didn't steal any gauze or tongue depressors. He pointedly looked at his watch. "Escort is here," he called out, gesturing to a bored-looking security guard. "Walk her to the curb. Make sure she leaves the premises entirely." Nia walked past him, her eyes fixed forward. She could feel his gaze on her back, burning with petty triumph. She pushed through the double doors of the ER entrance, leaving the sterile, controlled air of the hospital behind. The world outside was a violent contrast. It was pouring rain, a torrential, angry downpour that turned the asphalt into a black mirror reflecting the city's neon despair. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her cheeks. It was cold, a bone-deep chill that soaked through her sweater in seconds. Nia stood on the curb, the canvas bag heavy on her shoulder, water dripping from her eyelashes. She looked at her phone. No missed calls. No unread messages. She was alone. 3:55 a.m., and the city was asleep, indifferent to her ruin. She checked her bank balance app. $84. That was it. $84 between her and the abyss. She closed her eyes, letting the rain mingle with the hot tears she had refused to shed inside. She was the best trauma nurse in the state, and she was standing on a curb like unwanted refuse. She took a breath, tasting the ozone and exhaust fumes, trying to steady her shaking hands. She needed a plan. She needed a miracle. But miracles she had learned in the ER were in short supply. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration. A low, thrumming bass note that seemed to rise from the pavement itself. Nia opened her eyes. The rain was still falling, but the ambient noise of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of the highway, seemed to be swallowed by a new, encroaching presence. Down the long, empty access road leading to the ER entrance, lights appeared. Not the flashing red and blue of ambulances. Not the yellow of taxis. These were blinding, crystalline white beams, cutting through the rain sheets like lasers. It started with 1 vehicle, then 2, then 4. A convoy. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace, eating up the distance in seconds. They weren't normal cars. They were matte black, armored SUVs, massive and imposing, with tinted windows that swallowed the light. The lead vehicle was a sleek, extended sedan that looked less like a car and more like a rolling fortress, a Maybach of the kind Nia had only seen in music videos. Holloway had followed her out, ostensibly to smoke a cigarette under the awning, but really to savor the last moments of her humiliation. He froze, his lighter halfway to his mouth. He stared at the approaching convoy, his eyes widening. "Donors," he muttered, straightening his tie reflexively. Must be a VIP emergency. A senator. Or a CEO. He tossed his unlit cigarette into a puddle and stepped forward, adopting his best sycophantic smile. Get out of the way, Nia, he hissed, shoving her shoulder lightly. Move. You're blocking the drop-off zone. We have important guests. Nia stumbled back slightly, her shoes splashing in the gutter. But she didn't leave. She couldn't. She was transfixed by the convoy. There was something terrifyingly precise about the way they moved. They didn't slow down for the speed bumps. The suspension just absorbed the impact with a heavy thud. The lead SUVs fanned out, blocking the street traffic, creating a perimeter in seconds. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was an invasion. The vehicles screeched to a halt in perfect unison, the tires hissing on the wet pavement. For a moment, nothing happened. The engines idled with a deep, guttural growl that vibrated in Nia's chest. The red taillights bathed the wet concrete in the color of blood. Then, the doors of the escort SUVs flew open. Men poured out. They moved like liquid shadows, fast, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. They wore bespoke black suits that strained against massive shoulders, with earpieces coiled like translucent snakes behind their ears. They didn't look like hospital security. They looked like war machines wrapped in silk. Rain bounced off their shaved heads and broad backs. Holloway took a step forward, his smile trembling but still plastered on. Gentlemen, he called out, raising a hand in greeting. I am Director Holloway. If you have a patient, we have the VIP suite prepped and... He was ignored. Completely, utterly ignored. The men formed a phalanx, a human wall of muscle and stone, creating a corridor from the central Maybach to the curb. They didn't even look at Holloway. Their eyes were scanning the perimeter, the roof lines, the shadows. One of them, a giant of a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, reached into his jacket. Holloway flinched, perhaps expecting a weapon, but the man pulled out a black umbrella. He snapped it open with a sound like a gunshot. The rear door of the Maybach clicked. The sound was small, but in the sudden silence of the convoy, it sounded like a thunder crack. A driver in white gloves opened the door and stepped back, bowing his head low. A leg emerged. Tailored charcoal trousers, a shoe polished to a mirror shine that defied the rain. And then he stepped out.
Yehon.
The air seemed to leave the parking lot. He was tall, lean but with a coiled power that radiated from him like heat. He was Korean, perhaps 30 years old, with a face that could have graced a billboard if not for the cold, lethal intelligence in his eyes. He wore a long black trench coat over a suit that cost more than the entire hospital wing. His hair was dark and swept back, wet from the mist. He adjusted his cufflinks, a casual gesture that screamed of absolute control. He exuded danger. Not the petty, bureaucratic danger of Holloway, but the kind of ancient, violent danger that toppled governments. Holloway, sensing the shift in power, tried to reclaim the narrative. He rushed forward, bypassing the security line, his arrogance blinding him to the threat. Sir, I must insist you follow protocol. This is a restricted area. Ji-hoon didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes sliding over Holloway as if he were a stain on the wall. The look was so dismissive, so devoid of recognition, that Holloway faltered mid-step. Two of the guards stepped in front of the director, not touching him, just existing in his space, their sheer size forcing him back. Ji-hoon turned his attention away from the annoyance and scanned the curb. His eyes locked onto Nia. The world narrowed to that gaze. For a second, the harshness in his face vanished, replaced by an expression of profound relief, bordering on reverence. He ignored the rain soaking his coat. He ignored the gaping security guards. He walked past Holloway, walking straight toward the shivering nurse in the blue scrubs holding a canvas bag. He moved with a stalking grace, eating up the distance between them. Nia's breath caught in her throat. She gripped her bag tighter. She knew him, not as this titan of industry or crime, but from the memories of a chaotic night 3 years ago in a field hospital overseas, where she had stitched a man who shouldn't have survived. A man who had looked at her with fever-bright eyes and promised he would never forget. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. The guard with the umbrella was there instantly, shielding Mia from the downpour, leaving Ji-hoon exposed to the rain. He didn't care. He looked at her wet hair, her tired eyes, the cheap sweater clinging to her frame. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Holloway, unable to help himself, shouted from behind the wall of guards. "She doesn't work here. She's been terminated. You're wasting your time with." Ji-hoon raised one hand. A single finger. Silence fell instantly. The guards turned to look at Holloway, and for the first time, the director felt the cold grip of true terror. Ji-hoon turned back to Mia. He slowly lowered his head, bending his tall frame in a deep, formal bow of absolute respect. When he straightened, his eyes were soft, a stark contrast to the violence surrounding them. His voice was low, a rich baritone that cut through the noise of the storm. "I apologize for the delay," Ji-hoon said, his English perfect, clipped with a slight accent. "We had to clear the sector." He looked at the hospital, then back to her, noticing the badge missing from her chest. A dark shadow passed over his face, a flicker of rage directed at the building behind her, before he returned his gaze to hers. "You look tired, ma'am."
"Ma'am."
Holloway sputtered from the background, his voice cracking. "She's a nurse. A fired nurse." Ji-hoon finally acknowledged Holloway. He turned slowly, his movement distinct and terrifying. He looked at the director, then at the hospital doors, then back to Nia. "This man," Ji-hoon asked Nia, his voice deceptively calm. "Did he dishonor you?" Nia looked at Holloway. She saw the sweat on his upper lip, the trembling of his hands. She looked back at Ji-hoon, at the dangerous men who stood ready to tear the building apart on a single command. She felt a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't revenge. It was safety. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one holding up the weight of the world. "He fired me," Nia whispered, her voice steady, "for saving a patient who couldn't pay." A muscle feathered in his cheek. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Then he has done me a great favor." He stepped closer to Nia, extending a hand. He didn't grab her. He waited, palm open, an invitation. "The dead is called in, Nia."
"But not by you."
"By me." He gestured to the open door of the Maybach, where warm, amber light spilled out onto the wet pavement. "You do not belong in this place. You belong with us. We have need of your hands." And unlike them, he cast a look of withering contempt at Holloway. "We know their value. She can't just leave." Holloway yelled, panic setting in as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "There are non-compete clauses." "There are." "Quiet," Ji-hoon didn't shout. He didn't have to. The word was a command of nature. He looked at his head of security, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk. Director Holloway seems confused about the hierarchy of power here. "Explain it to him." Briefly. The guard nodded, as Ji-hoon gently guided Nia toward the car, placing a protective hand on her lower back. The guards turned toward Holloway. The director backed up, tripping over his own feet, colliding with the brick wall of the ER entrance. Nia paused at the car door. She looked back one last time. She saw the hospital that had drained her dry. She saw the man who had tried to break her spirit cowering before the men who now bowed to her. She looked up at Ji-hoon. His eyes were dark, intense, and filled with a promise of a life she couldn't yet imagine. "Where are we going?" she asked, the rain no longer touching her. Ji-hoon smiled, a rare, faint expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "To the only place worthy of you," he said. "Home." She slid into the leather seat. The door closed with a heavy, pressurized seal, shutting out the rain, the cold, and the life she had just lost. The engine purred. As the convoy began to move, Nia saw Holloway through the tinted glass, slumped against the wall, watching his authority dissolve into the taillights of the Korean Mafia. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was something else. Something vital. And for the first time in a long time, Nia didn't feel tired. She felt ready. The interior of the Maybach was a sanctuary of silence, hermetically sealed against the chaos of the storm raging outside. The seats were upholstered in buttersoft cognac leather that smelled of cedar and old money, a stark contrast to the antiseptic sting of the hospital ward Nia had just left. She sat stiffly at first, her canvas bag clutched to her chest like a shield, waiting for the reality of her abduction, or rescue, to set in. Ji-hoon sat across from her, his long legs crossed, watching her with an intensity that made the air feel thin. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached into a hidden compartment in the center console and retrieved a silver thermos. He poured a steaming, fragrant liquid into a small porcelain cup and slid it across the console toward her. "Barley tea," he said softly, the dashboard lights casting shadows across the sharp planes of his face. "It helps with the shock." "Drink." Nia took the cup, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was fever hot. She paused, her nurse's instinct overriding her fear. She looked at him closely for the first time, really looked at him, past the expensive suit and the aura of command. She saw the fine sheen of sweat on his forehead, the slight dilation of his pupils, the way his left hand rested too still against his ribs. "You're hurt," she stated, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. The memory washed over her then, visceral and sudden. 3 years ago, a sweltering makeshift tent in a conflict zone where the Geneva Convention was just a rumor. He had been brought in under a tarp, anonymously, riddled with shrapnel, bleeding out on a cot that smelled of mildew. The local doctors had triaged him as black, unsalvageable. They had moved on to the soldiers they could save. But Nia hadn't moved. She had worked for 6 hours straight, stitching muscle and clamping arteries by the light of a fading generator, ignoring the mortar fire shaking the ground. She remembered the scar she had left on his chest, a jagged line where she had literally held him together. Ji-hoon smiled now, a tight, pained expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Old habits," he murmured, unbuttoning his suit jacket. The crisp white dress shirt underneath was blooming with a fresh, dark crimson stain just above the hip. "We ran into complications securing the route to get to you. It seems my competitors knew I was coming into the city." He looked at the blood with detached curiosity, as if it belonged to someone else. "But the route had to be cleared. I could not let you wait in the rain." Nia set the tea down, the porcelain clicking sharply against the wood veneer. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had walked through the hospital parking lot, stood in the rain, bowed to her, and terrified Holloway, all while bleeding from a fresh gunshot wound. He had prioritized her dignity over his own survival. "You foolish man," she whispered, but the words lacked malice. They were thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. She wasn't the employee here. She wasn't the subordinate. She was the lifeline. She leaned forward, her hands moving automatically to assess the wound, her fear evaporating into the focused clarity of her profession. "Driver," she shouted, her voice snapping with a command authority that startled even herself. "How far out are we?" "He's losing blood volume." "Drive faster," the driver, a stoic man with a thick neck, looked in the rearview mirror, his eyes widening as he saw Nia leaning over his boss, pressing a linen napkin against the wound. He didn't question her. He didn't look to Ji-hoon for confirmation. He simply floored the accelerator, the massive engine roaring as the car surged forward, cutting through the night like a missile. Nia looked back at Ji-hoon. He was fading, his eyelids fluttering, but he was smiling. "I knew," he rasped, his hand covering hers as she applied pressure. "I knew you were the only one who could fix this." The convoy tore through the city streets, ignoring red lights and speed limits, flanked by the motorcycle outriders who had joined the formation, blocking intersections with military precision. They didn't head toward the downtown hospitals. They headed toward the skyline, toward the solitary, glass and steel needle of the Helix Tower, a structure that dominated the city's financial district. The car didn't stop at the front entrance. It swung into a private underground cargo bay that opened with a hydraulic hiss. The moment the vehicle stopped, the doors were ripped open. But it wasn't doctors who swarmed the car, it was soldiers. Heavily armed men with panic in their eyes, looking at their fallen leader. They froze when they saw Nia, a woman in a cheap sweater and blue scrubs, her hands covered in the boss's blood. "Back up," she ordered, stepping out of the car and pulling Ji-hoon's arm over her shoulder to support his weight. "I need a gurney."
Now.
"Do not touch the wound unless you are scrubbed in." The men, terrifying giants who likely dissolved bodies for a living, hesitated. They looked at Ji-hoon. He was pale, his knees buckling, but he nodded once at Nia. That nod was law. They moved with a chaotic urgency, rushing Ji-hoon into a private elevator that shot upward at a stomach-churning speed. When the doors opened on the penthouse level, Nia expected a bedroom or a makeshift clinic. She gasped. It was a trauma center. A fully equipped, state-of-the-art medical bay that rivaled the best teaching hospitals in the country. There were monitors, a ventilator, a crash cart, and a sterile field already prepped. But there was no staff. Just the cold, humming machinery. "Where are the doctors?" Nia yelled as she helped the guards hoist Ji-hoon onto the operating table. One of the lieutenants, a man named Deu, looked at her with desperate eyes. "We don't use hospitals." "Too many questions." "We have a surgeon on retainer, but he is unavailable." Stuck in traffic, he looked at the monitor where Ji-hoon's heart rate was climbing erratically. "You are here. He went to get you." Nia realized then that this wasn't a coincidence. Ji-hoon hadn't just come to save her from unemployment. He had come because he knew he was walking into a trap, and the only person he trusted to put him back together was the woman who had done it before. She didn't have time to process the manipulation. She stripped off her sweater, revealing the scrub top underneath. She washed her hands in the sink, the water scalding hot, scrubbing with a ferocity that turned her skin red. "I need O-negative blood, hung and pressure-bagged. Now," she commanded, snapping gloves on. "Cut his shirt. Get me the ultrasound." Deu and the other guards scrambled, clumsy with fear, handing her instruments with trembling hands. Nia was the eye of the hurricane. The panic of the room broke against her calm. She was no longer the fired nurse, the victim of bureaucracy. She was the conductor of life and death. Nia placed the ultrasound probe on Ji-hoon's abdomen. The screen flickered. Fluid in the Morrison's pouch. Internal bleeding. "He has a nicked spleen and a retroperitoneal hematoma," she announced, her voice flat and hard. "I have to go in. If I don't clamp it in 3 minutes," he codes. "Give me the scalpel. And for God's sake, someone turn up the lights." The room fell into a terrified silence, broken only by the rhythmic beep-beep-beep of the cardiac monitor and the wet sound of suction. Nia worked with a speed that blurred the eye. She made the incision, her hands steady as rock. She wasn't thinking about the Mafia or the rain or Holloway. She was thinking about anatomy. The vessel was deep, obscured by blood. "Retract here," she ordered Deu, guiding his massive, shaking hand to hold the clamp. "Don't move. If you sneeze, he dies." The big man held his breath until his face turned purple. Nia reached in, her fingers navigating the damage blindly until she felt the pulse of the bleeder.
There.
She clamped it. The suction cleared the field. The monitor, which had been racing like a hummingbird, began to slow. Beep, beep,
Beep.
a collective exhale swept through the room. She sutured the spleen with precise, tiny movements, the needle flashing under the surgical lights. She was an artist, and this was her masterpiece. She worked for another hour, cleaning, closing, and stabilizing. By the time she tied the final knot and applied the dressing, her own adrenaline was beginning to crash. She stepped back, stripping off the bloody gloves. Ji-hoon was stable. His color was returning. He was asleep, the anesthesia doing its work, looking younger and less dangerous than he had any right to. Nia leaned against the counter, her legs suddenly feeling like water.
나 왜 앞으로 채택?
The terrifying enforcer looked at her with an expression of awe. He didn't say a word. He simply bowed, low and deep, his forehead nearly touching the floor. Then the other guards did the same. A room full of killers, bowing to a nurse. "Thank you, ma'am," Do-yu whispered. "The boss. He said you were a magician." He was right. Nia looked at her hands. They were clean now, but she could still feel the phantom warmth of the life she had saved. She realized she had never received this kind of respect at St. Jude's. Not once. There, she was a resource to be exploited. Here, she was a deity. Morning broke over the city, casting a pale, golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Nia sat in a leather armchair next to the bed, watching the sunrise. She had showered in a bathroom that was larger than her entire apartment, washing away the night's grime with soaps that smelled of sandalwood and jasmine. She wore a silk robe she had found in the closet, wrapped tight around her.
이혼 스테르.
His eyes opened, groggy but sharp. He looked at the ceiling, then turned his head to find her. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice rough. Nia poured him a glass of water and held the straw to his lips. "You passed out on my watch," she said dryly. "I don't leave patients until they are discharged," he drank, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am not a patient, Nia. And you are not a nurse. Not anymore." He tried to sit up, wincing, but she gently pushed him back down. "I have a proposition," he said, lying back against the pillows. "St. Jude's pays you what? 60,000 a year? To be insulted by children in suits." He gestured weakly to the room, to the city below. "I am building a private medical network. For my people. For their families. For those the system throws away, like the man you saved last night. I need a director. Someone who answers to no one but her own conscience." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "The salary is 500,000.
Starting.
Plus a stake in the company. And full autonomy. You fire who you want. You treat who you want. You buy the $5,000 medicine, and you don't ask for permission." Nia stared at him. It was a fantasy. It was madness. But as she looked at him, she realized it wasn't a bribe. It was an investment. He wasn't buying her silence. He was arming her compassion. Her phone, which she had left on the side table, began to buzz.
It was a text message.
Then another. Then a call. She glanced at the screen. Director Holloway. The voicemail notification popped up. She could almost hear his wheedling tone, the panic in his voice as the board of directors likely came down on him for losing a top trauma nurse and insulting a major donor in the same night. He probably wanted her back. He probably had a revised offer. Nia looked at the phone, then at Ji-hoon. He was watching her, waiting for her choice. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone, walked to the balcony door, and slid it open. The wind was fresh and clean, the storm having passed. She held the phone over the railing, 40 stories up. "I think," she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength of absolute vindication, "that I am overqualified for my old position." She let go. The phone tumbled, end over end, disappearing into the urban canyon below. She turned back to the room, to the man who saw her worth, and smiled. "When do I start? You see, the world will try to tell you that your value is a line item on a budget sheet. They will try to tell you that your empathy is a weakness, that your skill is replaceable, and that you should be grateful for the scraps they throw from the table. They are wrong. Nia didn't need St. Jude's. St. Jude's needed Nia, and they only realized it when she was gone. There is a terrifying power in knowing your own worth. It scares the Halloways of the world because it makes them irrelevant. So, look at where you are standing right now. Are you growing or are you just shrinking to fit the room? If you are a giant in a world of small people, do not cut off your legs to fit their expectations. Walk away. Walk into the rain if you have to, because somewhere there is a kingdom waiting for a queen, and they're just waiting for you to realize that you already wear the crown. Don't wait for them to fire you. Fire them. And when you find your people, the ones who look at you with awe, not judgment, never let them go. Value is not given, it is claimed. Go claim yours.